Today, we are going through the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4. Unfortunately, this recording is a re-recording because the original recording of the class meeting, I am sad to say there was a technical issue with that recording. And so now I am re-recording this presentation, this teaching here at home, so that we can continue having class recordings or material that people can catch up on or start from the very beginning and not really miss anything as we go through the entire Bible from beginning to end. Unfortunately, with that means that we are not going to be able to have the sort of robust and very rich conversation that we had yesterday when we actually had the meeting. There were some great conversations in that meeting, and unfortunately, they are not going to be captured in this. But with that being said, of course, the presentation itself and the teaching itself will be consistent with the original teaching. And so I'm excited that I get the chance to make up for the technical issue and record today a re-recording of Genesis chapter 4. And so without further ado, let us get into this class meeting. All right, so today we are looking at Genesis chapter 4. This is an incredible chapter, not only because, as it has been commented in class before, that the chapter and verse numbers are not consistent with how we are supposed to read the text. The text itself is linear and sequential, that this text from beginning to end doesn't really have breaks. It has some internal breaks that we can identify, but mostly if we end a story in chapter 3, that story really is continuing in chapter 4. And so we are continuing down the mountain. If you guys remember from previous class meetings, I said that we are ascending a mountain as we read from Genesis 2 to 3, that Adam is created outside of Eden, outside of the garden, in the dry land. He's placed up into the cosmic mountain. The Garden of Eden is a cosmic mountain. That's the image of the Garden of Eden as expressed in Ezekiel. And so now, as they were expelled from the garden, now they are going down the garden, right? And so in that, we have Cain and Abel still in Eden. We have Cain and Abel still in that region and theoretically still down a slope of that mountain. Of course, I'm talking not only in a sense of a literalism for the story itself, of imagining how you would imagine the story, but of course symbolically and metaphorically, that there is a descent that is happening. Of course, it's called the fall. And as we know, it is a continuous fall from Genesis chapter 3 to 4 to 6 to 8 and 11. It really is a continuous fall all the way down until we enter into the story of Abraham. This is what the prologue of the Bible is all about. God created a good world. He created a world for flourishing. He created a temple realm for priests to represent him rightly. And then through their actions and through the actions of their descendants, the world spirals. As I've said before, it goes into a death spiral, meaning that ultimately what happens in this chapter is going to have repercussions that will extend down the generations and ultimately lead to destruction. So with that being said, let us go ahead and get into this reading, Genesis chapter 4. I'm going to go ahead and read it, of course, and I might stop at some point, but probably not. We'll just read through the whole chapter, including the Lamech stuff, the genealogy, and then we will get into the presentation. All right, let's do it. Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel for his part brought the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain said to his brother Abel, Let us go out to the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is your brother Abel? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me. Then the Lord said to him, Not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and he built a city and named it Enoch, after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Arad, to Arad the father of Mehujael, and Mehujael the father of Methushael, and Methushael the father of Lamech. Lamech took 2 wives. The name of the one was Adah, and the name of the other Zilhah. Adah bore Jabal, and he was the ancestor of those who live in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the ancestor of all those who play the lyre and pipe. Zilhah bore Tubal-Cain, who made all kinds of bronze and iron tools. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zilhah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, truly Lamech 77-fold. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another child instead of Abel, because Cain killed him. To Seth was born also a son, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to invoke the name of Yahweh. All right, so that is the reading of Genesis chapter 4, the chapter in its entirety. And it is at this point in the meeting that normally I open up the discussion just to hear from everyone who's attending in person, to hear from them sort of what is jumping up at them from this chapter, what is arising from the text that they are noticing. Some people mentioned the fact that there's a mark on Cain. What does that mean? Is that connected to the end of the Bible, the end of the book, the end of the story with the mark of the beast, for example? There's a lot of speculation having to do with that. Someone else talked about how Cain, in his response to God's confrontation of his murder of Abel, is so many of the words are Cain focused, in the sense that I can't do this, right? This idea that the Hebrew words that are being used within this chapter are very self-centered when it comes to Cain's response. So that was something else that someone mentioned. There are a number of different things like that, and unfortunately, again, that commentary is lost. But I want to invite you to comment below what is jumping out of the page after the reading in your opinion. What is coming out and what sort of is coming to mind as we read through the chapter. Okay, so now let's get into the presentation. So remember that we are talking about prehistory. What is prehistory? It means that we're talking about things in ways that are not described in historical terms. They're described in terms of, here are the ancient backstories and the most ancient prologues to all of human history. It's a matter of, when you have history as moderns understand it, it's very concerned with the details. It's very concerned with the who, what, when, where, and why. When you're looking at something like the story of Cain and Abel and much of the prehistory accounts, they're dealing in things like the origin of the universe. They're dealing with patterns that they find that the writer sees in humanity and is drawing sort of an origin story about these patterns, that it goes back to a point. The patterns that manifest in the world, they're going to go back to a point, and here's the point at which they manifest. And the point at which they manifest the origin story of these patterns, of these ways of things happening in the world, that has to be reflective of the grand experience, you could say, the repetitive experience. What are the themes? What are the steps that appear time and time again whenever this pattern emerges? So, of course, in the story of Cain and Abel, you have this pattern of hostile brothers. In fact, the first version, or as I have called Adam, the first of the pattern, the Greek would be archetype, right? And by archetype, I don't mean that the story doesn't mean to imply that this is not something that actually happened, that there wasn't an actual couple, that there was an actual pair of brothers, that one killed the other. Of course, we know that has happened time and time and time and time and time again throughout history. That's kind of the point. It has happened time and time and time and time again throughout history. Of course, it goes back to an original version of that. And what the Bible is doing and what we're reading is the original version of that. And what does that mean for the story of the Bible? Of course, the story of Cain and Abel, as it's being told in this section of prehistory that is Genesis 1 to 11, is essential. It genuinely is essential to understanding what is going on in a grand way, in a meta-narrative way, in the entire text of the Bible. Now, in prehistory, we have talked a little bit about one of the natures of prehistory is that it focuses on the flood narrative. This is, of course, the case in all of these ancient prehistories from the ancient Near East. And so, in this passage, we are really starting with the prelude to the flood. It's the prologue within the prologue. So Genesis 1 to 11 is a prologue to Genesis itself, as well as the entire Bible itself. And within this, we're kind of coming, as we come down the mountain, as we come down the garden, from the garden, now we're getting into setting up what is going to come in Genesis chapter 6 and Genesis chapter 7, 8, and 9. The flood really is the most consequential event of Genesis 3 to 11. It is the staple. It is the point. And we've talked a little bit about this in previous meetings, about there is a ancient way of viewing the end of the world. And it isn't an end of the world in the future, it's an end of the world in the past. That at one point in history, for the ancient person, at one point in their, of course, much more recent history relative to them than to us, they have this concept that the world is fresh and new because at one point there was a destruction. And what do I mean by fresh and new? I don't mean that in some way the geography of the land has been radically reshifted, or in some ways they're not thinking on these levels. The level that they are thinking of is human civilization. It had existed, and now it has been reborn to a certain extent. There's a refreshing that has happened, but with that, there has been a loss. There has been a loss of glory days, that the ancient humans, prior to the flood, they lived these very long lives. They were great kings on the earth. They were mighty men. They were great warriors. They were almost mythic in their quality. They were superhuman. And so this idea of having these superhuman ancient past figures, the idea of having these glory days, the time in which before the gods sent the waters upon the earth in order to destroy all of the ancient glorious human society. And so we're kind of getting into the beginning of that. We're getting into the early stages of this glorious human society. Again, to the pagans, it's glorious. In the Bible, that ancient society is critiqued, right? So it's not that the gods send the flood because the humans are making too much noise, they're having too much fun, they're partying too loud, which would be in maybe one of the pagan accounts. But in the biblical account, the reason the flood is sent is because of something like the Cain and Abel story. The Cain and Abel story is establishing a foundation for a pattern of violence that is going to continue throughout the generations, as I've already said. And this pattern of violence obviously is going to spin out of control into more of that, even more of that death spiral that I've talked about in Genesis chapter 6, and we'll be getting into that next time. So at the dawn of human civilization is the murder of one's own little brother. If last time in Genesis chapter 3, we had sort of the origin of the temple realm, Genesis chapter 2 and 3, the origin of the temple realm. We had Genesis chapter 1, it's the formation of the world generally, that humanity is to be good, that they are to be God's imagers, that they are to be fruitful, multiplying, flourishing on the land, bringing about life, purpose, order, and harmony. Now in Genesis chapter 4, we have the dawn of human civilization or society, right? So the command was to be fruitful and multiply, but in this chapter, they are going to be fruitful and multiplying, of course, but the fruitful multiplication is actually born out of a murder, right? That's sort of the thing that instigates this process of Cain building a city and building up human society. Okay, so let's get into this even more. We're going to talk about the two brothers just a little bit. And I just want you to, I've already said it, but I want you to acknowledge and notice the thematic and mythic nature of the setup of this story. So let's just talk about mythology for a second. Mythology, or the term that I'm using here, mythic, again, doesn't imply, or it doesn't have to imply, that there wasn't some instigating event in real time, in real flesh and blood history that this is not talking about, or excuse me, that this is talking about that didn't happen. What I'm saying is the mythic nature of the setup of the story is that it is setting this pattern that is so foundational to human psychology, that is so foundational to human reality, that is so foundational to our experience of the world, that it is telling a story in such a way that it's like, here is the story of all stories when it comes to this topic. And of course, this topic is about the hostile brothers, the murder and the hostility between people groups, between persons, between individuals, even more so than just people groups. The idea here is that there is a foundation layer of human societal development, right? And of course, it feels mythic only because it's so foundational in how it's setting things up. Here you have two individuals who come from the same mother, who are irreconcilably opposite of each other, right? The idea is questioning, why are we so different from each other? Why do I find myself having such a hard time getting along with the people around me, right? Why do I find myself to be so different? Why do I find myself at odds with other people at different times? Why is there hostility? And here you have the most foundational layer you can get. You have a mother and two brothers and hostility between the brothers. And so you can see how this is painting a picture that is really important as a foundational layer, sort of that they stand as these archetypes, as I said, these first patterns or first of the pattern, these first examples of really something that's going to happen time and time and time and time again throughout the Bible and throughout history. So let's look at Cain and Abel. Cain is said to be a tiller of the ground, and Abel is said to be a keeper of the flocks. It's at this point in our meeting that I asked the class what they really thought this means. And ultimately, I'm glad that we came down to, because I believe this is the truth of what it's trying to tell us, that Cain being a tiller of the ground and Abel being a keeper of the flocks, it's really talking about the space in which they are inhabiting, that they are opposite spaces. What does that mean? So Cain being a tiller of the ground, this is a way of saying that Cain's space and where he lives is located, it's planted, it's rooted. Because if you're a tiller of the ground, if you're a farmer, if you are someone who is working with crops, that keeps you in a location. It keeps you steady, and it keeps you in a space where you can start to build a city. So this is connected to sort of him becoming the first city dweller later on in the story and building the first city. But him being a tiller of the ground, if you build crops, or, if you build a crop field, you are also building a wall around that crop field to protect it from predators and from thieves, right? And if you are building a wall around those crops, you are also building irrigation, and you are also you're constructing these elements that are bringing about this civilization, this infrastructure, right? So Cain is a tiller of the ground. Of course, this is not a bad thing. Adam is supposed to be a gardener, but it is an element of the curse that the ground itself is cursed, right? In Genesis chapter 3. So Cain, he's downward focused, right? He is working on the all of the crops and all of the soil and concerned with what is being produced out of the ground in such a way that he is experiencing that curse of Genesis chapter 3, that the ground is cursed and that ultimately Cain goes back down into the ground, of course, as we all do. Abel, he's a keeper of the flocks. What we said here is that being a keeper of the flocks, it's nearly the opposite, or virtually the opposite of what I just said about Cain. So Abel, instead of being located in a space, planted and rooted in a space, Abel is a wanderer, right? What do you do if you have flocks? You wander with them. You lead flocks in pasture land. So the idea here is that while Cain is looking down as he tills the ground, Abel is looking with his eyes up, looking to where he is going, looking to where he can find green pastures for his flock. There's something a bit more fatherly or motherly, you could say, about Abel being a keeper of the flocks. There is a care for the animals that is happening here. So again, they're both sort of relatively working out the purpose of Adam and Eve in the garden. But Cain, again, he's dealing with the curse of the ground, while Abel he's sort of doing that more idealistic thing about naming the animals. He's interacting with the animals far more. And again, he is in pasture land. So he's not located in a particular spot. He is walking and he is journeying and sojourning in the land. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Let's just look at their names for a second in the Hebrew and what they mean. So Cain means to smith or to make or to create something, right? So the name Cain is linguistically connected to the idea of smithing or crafting. Interestingly, this is a thematic connection with what Cain and his genealogical line will ultimately be famous for: the origins of human society, urbanization, and technological advancement. So the idea of smithing, crafting, making something, that is what you were to associate with the idea of Cain. And who Cain is the line of Cain is the line that continues to create order, you could say. But is that order a good order? It's a sort of twisted order. It comes out of this death of Abel. So technological advancement, urbanization, human society and human development, technological revolution is embedded within this story and within the person of Cain and in the line of Cain. And we'll continue to talk about that in a few minutes. Let's talk about the name for Abel. The name in Hebrew for Abel is Hevel. And Hevel is what is used, if you've read the book of Ecclesiastes, for example, the word that translates to vanity or vapor or meaninglessness. Don't draw too intense connection there about the meanings. The point here is that Hevel, it means mist, or it means vapor, or it means smoke. And so Abel's name, otherwise used in the Bible to refer to vapor or a puff of smoke, the fleeting nature of Abel's life might be perhaps the reason or the indication that is being given here. Abel, of course, will be the first death recorded in Scripture, even though it says of Adam, this day you will die. And of course, there's a spiritual death that is involved there, but Adam himself is still walking. And so he's not just the first death, but he's the first murdered. It's a premature death, you could say. It's a death that is not a natural death, but it's a death that comes out of violence. It's a death that comes out of a sin act of Cain. So there could be something said there. This idea of vapor, this idea of sort of Abel's life was taken in vain, right? Or there could be another aspect that Abel, of course, he's more concerned in his psyche about the sacrifice that he's going to make. And so then he is about Cain. So maybe, Cain is concerned about building the city, where Abel is concerned about the sacrifice itself. Why is this connected to sacrifice? Well, I'm talking about the smoke that will rise from the sacrifice. That's a big deal in regard to sacrifices, is that the sacrifice is turned into a an invisible quality, something that is transitioning back into the heavenlies, we could say, as the smoke rises up into the heavenly realm. So that's sort of the difference reflective in their names of these two figures. One is concerned with the making, with the building, with the tilling of the ground, the sort of development aspect of human society. And Abel, of course, the other, is concerned with wandering the pasture lands, with the sacrifice, you could say, with raising the pure flock, with raising the pure sheep. Okay, and these are painted as sort of opposite. They're painted as sort of different things in Genesis chapter 4. So, of course, we have Cain and Abel. They're the offspring of Adam and Eve. They're two brothers at the door of the garden. We're going to explain through that, or I'm going to explain through that in just a minute. So Abel is a shepherd of the flocks. This is just sort of a recap or summary. Cain is a tiller of the ground, meaning he's a city dweller, versus the pasture dweller, who is Abel. Cain is the first murderer. Abel is the first murdered. And even there you have, just think about that thematically, you have archetypic, it is archetypes, the idea of the first murderer on the earth, the first murdered of the earth, and what that means for every sort of manifestation of what it means for a murderer and a murdered person to be in a story, right? In the story of Cain and Abel, you really have the origin of all of human violence, according to the Bible. Abel is conceived of as the first slain prophet. And we're going to get into that. That's going to be immensely important in this story. And of course, Cain, the founder of the very first city, also sort of directly connected to Cain being the first slain prophet. So let's get into this flocks thing a little bit more. So Abel is described as a keeper of flocks in contrast to Cain. Notice the implied nature of a herdsman, one who wanders pasture land in hunt for provision for himself and for his flock. The inherent nomadic and nature-focused lifestyle of a shepherd is universally conveyed in the Bible as a kind of idealistic way of life in which one lives off the land and relies totally on God's continual provision. So there is a very, very obvious bias, I could say, in the Bible and in the biblical writings against this idea of human construction, right? The idea of human construction versus what nature provides. You could say that the Bible does have an idealistic, nature-focused bent. So one example of this I can give is the difference between cisterns, which are these hollowed out caverns that ancient people would use to capture and hold on to water. Cisterns versus what is conceived of as living water. That is water that is coming naturally from springs, that is coming up from, well springs in the ground, that's coming up from snowfall and snowmelt. So it's really interesting, how these things are painted, that the cistern is a broken system. And a cistern is you're trying to hold on to provision for yourself in such a way that it's speaking to something about your soul, right? Ultimately the cisterns end up broken, whereas you should be looking for the living water, the water that never runs out, right? And another example of that would be something like this, in that the shepherd is a herdsman who wanders, you could say, very perilously through realms that are not exactly fit for living. They wander in wilderness. They wander in desert looking for grassland. Of course, why are they doing that? You're taking your herds into less ideal places where grass is grown, where only grass can grow, not the most lush places. It is in those lush places that you are tilling the ground, that you are bringing about fruitful produce. And so with that, again, remember, I'm not saying that in the Bible it's presenting that the ground itself, or that tilling the ground or creating farming produce, that is inherently bad. And I'm not saying that the Bible is just like, oh, well, everyone should be a monk, right? Everyone should go out into the wilderness and live out sort of on the sustenance of the land, live off the land, right? That's not what I'm saying. It's not about escaping the city, and it's not about, this is bad and this is good. The point here is we're noticing the patterns, and we're noticing the elements of these different experiences in life, these different ways of living that manifest different patterns, even in the human character and spirit. And so Abel is someone who wanders pasture land in a hunt for provision. This is something that every chosen representative of God in the Bible, time and time and time again, if you are a chosen representative of God, if you are a prophet, or if you're someone who God has called into some sort of mission in the Bible, without exception, that person at some point or another, probably, I mean, I'm probably not every individual, but most of them, you could say the 99% of the time, you are called out at some point in your lives into the wild of nature, right? Into those wilds of nature. And the point here is that those who are called out, those prophetic individuals who are called into the wilderness, they are called to recede to the place where only God can provide for them, right? Where they're led by the Spirit to greener pastures, where they have to keep their eyes up ahead, where they have to keep their eyes forward and focused on where they are being led and where they're leading their flock, right? And so with Abel also being described as a pasture herdsman, this is, again, that first example, this archetype, this first pattern, or first of the pattern of someone like Abraham, who is called out of the city of Babylon, called out of Ur of the Chaldeans, and called into to wander in tents with herds in the promised land, right? Moses, who's called out of the realm of Egypt, called out from his role as a prince of Egypt into the land of Midian, where he is wandering the wilds as a herdsman, as a shepherd. Of course, David, it's sort of the reverse. He's not called out of his city, but but he is spending his life as a shepherd boy, where now in his later years, he is building a city, right? The first idealistic city in the Bible, you could say, which is Jerusalem, of course. And so you have these figures, even Jesus himself. Not only is he called the Great Shepherd, but he spends his time wandering in the wilderness, of course, in the same way that Israel wandered in the wilderness, looking for the manna provision, looking for the moment in which bitter water will be made into sweet water. The water will come out of the rock. The cloud will keep them shaded by day, and the pillar of fire will light up the night. It's this idea that you're in a valley of shadow of death, right? But the shepherd, the great shepherd, who is God, is leading you as you are leading the flock. So all of that to say, this Abel presentation is as one who wanders the pasture, like his future descendants will as well. Abraham, Moses, all of these prophets, every prophet, you could say, also has one point or another in their lives where they are called out to the wilderness. Isaiah, this is the case. Of course, John the Baptist, this is the case where he spends his life, it says, eating locusts and honey and wearing camel's hair, and he was a wild man living out in the wild, right? So the idea of going out to the desert, of course, in Christianity, in the history of the church, you have the idea of the desert fathers and the desert mothers, these mystical figures who retreated out into live in caves and these things, almost like the prophets of old. They're sort of continuing this pattern. And of course, that's where monasteries are born out of that idea. As opposed to Cain, as opposed to Nimrod, who is the builder of Babylon, as opposed to Pharaoh. And these are these figures directly opposed to, Cain is directly opposed to Abel, or opposite, you could say, the counterpart. Nimrod, the counterpart to Abraham. Nimrod builds Babylon. Abraham is called out by the Most High God out of Babylon. Moses and Pharaoh, these antagonists in the story of the Exodus. Okay, so I think we've talked at length about the differences between Cain and Abel and sort of how they are being presented. Of course, you don't really get that if you're just reading it just for what it says right there in the text, Cain is a tiller of the ground, Abel is a shepherd of flocks. But if you understand everything within the greater context of the biblical narrative, the biblical story, and you sort of think about it, you meditate on this for a little bit, you'll come to see that this is tapping into a pattern that you see throughout the Bible about the difference between pasture and city and what that means. So let's talk about Cain and Abel's, their relative sacrifice. Okay, this is sort of the most famous part of the story and the biggest and most important point here. So let's get into it. So of course, this is as a recap. We are in now the exile from the garden. Within the garden, you have the presence of God, which brings forth all of these other things. Fellowship with man and with God, between people and between man and God. You have fruit trees. You have all of this abundance. Think of a tropical paradise, right? This idea of you have everything you need. The land and the trees are yielding great bounties of sustenance, right? That you are being sustained in your life, and that, of course, is bringing you eternal life. This idea that you will not die in the garden, right? It's safety, it's productivity, it's abundance. Now we are exiled from the garden. We're still in the land of Eden, which is a lush land, which is a land, you could say, flowing with milk and honey to a certain extent. Eden, of course, means delight. But still outside of the garden, you have danger in childbearing, right? So the toil that is described in the curse passage. You have the broken relationships. This is also described. You have disharmony. You have thorns and thistles that come up out of the ground now, not just the harmonious fruit trees, but now you have the harshness of reality. You have the vulnerability of Adam and Eve now that they are able to die, right, outside of the garden. Or that they will, of course, most certainly die, I should say. You have the plants of the field, and of course, you have everything goes down into dust. Now, I've said repetitively that we are still in the land of Eden. Why is that the case? Well, if you understand what the temple realm is, and if you don't remember, go back to the previous recording where we talked about how Eden reflects the organization of the temple. Of course, Adam is created out of the dry ground, and then he's placed in the garden that the Lord planted in Eden, is what it says. And now they have been driven from the garden, is what Genesis chapter 3 says. And then, of course, in Genesis chapter 4, now after the murder of Abel, Cain is going to be driven east of the land of Eden, is what the text will say. That's not just, those are context clues within the story itself, but again, understanding the temple realm, they are making a sacrifice, right? And if the garden is mirroring one-to-one the temple or the tabernacle, the organization of those things, then the temple and the tabernacle, right outside of the inner sanctuary of the, of the temple itself, the holy place, that's where you find the altar, right? So you have the courtyard. Here, I'll just go back actually. So the dry land is the courtyard of the temple. You could say everything beyond the dry land is that wilderness, is that chaos, right? Is the world beyond, right? You have, so the courtyard, the dry land is the world beyond. The dry land is the chaotic realm. This is the realm that was supposed to be blessed by the rivers that flowed from Eden. So when you get to the land of Eden, that's when you get to the courtyard. So you're in the courtyard. This is now you've entered into the walls that separate sort of the rest of the world from the temple realm. And that's where you find the altar. And on the altar, the priest makes the sacrifice. And then after the sacrifice is made and accepted, then the priest enters into what is the holy place, the Garden of Eden. And of course, the Holy of Holies is in the center of the Garden of Eden. That's the tree of life. It's the throne of God in the temple where the Ark of the Covenant. And of course, we'll get into the Ark of the Covenant much later on. But for now, understand that what they're doing is they are making sacrifices, right? Within Eden. That means they're making sacrifices outside of the garden, but still within this temple realm. It's this idea of you are seeing the temple as it's described in later books of the Bible. You're seeing it as it's described here in this story. It's at this point that I was asked by one of the members of the class, by one of the attendants. They said, this is not described here in the text. So how would we know this, right? And they didn't exactly say that, but essentially it's these descriptions aren't here of the temple. Where are they found? Of course, they're found in the book of Exodus and the books of Leviticus and Numbers and these books that are talking repetitively, and First Kings when it's talking about the temple. They're talked about in these ways later on. And so you have to think about the original author, the original reader. Let's even assume for a second that Moses himself is writing Genesis chapter 4, which it could be possible. It's not exactly certain. The tradition, of course, says that he is the writer of Genesis chapter 4. Even in his day, as he theoretically is writing the story, you have the tabernacle. You have that place present. So original hearers of this text will understand, because just down the road, just over there, let's say they walked by it on their way to the reading, to the public reading in which they're hearing this story. They understand that this is how the temple is laid out, the tabernacle is laid out, and so they are observing. Again, it's giving you the context clues within the story to understand what they already know in their own experience. Again, let's assume Moses is not the writer for the sake of argument. And people are hearing this story in Jerusalem, and they are, again, every 7 times a year they're going to the temple with their family to go to the festival to make sacrifices, and they're understanding the priest is entering into the holy place through the sacrifices that they give to the priest to make. The priest goes into the holy place on their behalf, and so I guess that's that's sort of the point. Is these things are implicit. If they were explicit, it would sort of bloat the story. It also wouldn't be as interesting. The point here is that we are coming to understand through our meditation, through our deep study, through our attention. The Bible is causing us to pay attention, right? So that we can understand what is going on. It's causing us to pay attention to the overarching narrative, I think is the point, that is helping us understand what's going on here. Let's talk about altars and offerings for a second. So at this point in the class, I asked, where in your life do you encounter altars? Do we encounter altars in our day-to-day life? Of course, if you grew up in church at all, maybe you understand an altar to be a little bench at the front of the church, like by the platform or the stage where the pastor or preacher or priest normally is. Or in a more liturgical church, an altar is where the Eucharist is offered, right? The offering of thanksgiving. There's another experience that we have, though, when it comes to altars, and it is at a wedding. Where do husbands and wives say their vows and get married? And is there a sacrifice that is being made at the wedding altar? You could say there is. That a man and a woman are coming together in unity, that one is offering themselves to the other, and maybe offering up certain rights, offering up certain things about their life that they're no longer going to have access to. Let's just say privacy, for one thing. The idea that, of course, as a married couples still allow each other privacy, but I just mean you're now bound to live in a house with someone else, right? You're bound to take care of them till death do us part, in sickness and in health, for better or for worse. I vow to love you and take care of you, right? So there is a sacrifice that is happening here, and it's a covenant. The marriage covenant is a covenant between persons and between God, of course. That the vow is being made in the sight of God, and it is ultimately God who binds that marriage covenant, right? What God has joined together, that makes God the subject, the primary subject of the marriage. That He is the one who is joining the two. So you can see how even at a wedding altar, altars represent the basis of covenant relationship, right? The idea here, and this is, of course, consistent even in the ancient world, that if there are two parties that are going to make a covenant with one another, they would make sacrifices together, that they would have relationship together. That sacrifice and altars is where we would make sacrifices. Of course, lots of sacrifices also were made, and you would actually consume the animal that you have sacrificed. It's only the whole or burnt offerings that go completely up to God. But you're in this setting where altar is establishing a relationship, right? So why bring offerings to God? The sons of Eve were acting in the priestly role designed for their parents in the garden. So that would be number one thing. Of course, there are two altars in the temple. There's the altar outside of the tabernacle, or outside the curtain of the temple, or the doors of the temple. And this is where the sacrifices are made of living animals, so that the blood would cover for, you could say, sin, or it's a gift offering, or things like that. And then the priest enters into the temple, and it is at that point that the priest is in the temple that they are also making incense offerings on the incense altar. So conceivably, if you do have these one-to-one correlations between the temple and the garden, what is going on in the garden is that what Adam and Eve are doing, what they're participating in the temple, of course, they're eating the fruit of the garden as the priest eats the showbread or the bread of the presence of the temple. There's bread that is to be placed within the temple that they're to eat, which of course represents the bread of life. But they're also offering incense. And so within the temple is this aromatic smell. What is incense? It's a smell that is rising within and filling in a smoky way, creating a mystical environment, right, within the temple holy place. And of course, that's what the garden represents. It represents this mystical, pleasant realm. You could say that when the incense is being offered, they are smelling the smells of Eden, right? And they're eating that bread and things like that. So now Adam and Eve Cain and Abel are taking up the roles of offerings that are being made in that courtyard. They had not entered back into the garden yet. So Cain and Abel are operating in the assumption that relationship with God can be reestablished through a sacrifice. So they have an intuition that it says that through sacrifice, this relationship that was broken of the priests that were supposed to be in the inner sanctum, that were supposed to be in the holy place, they have now been expelled. Of course, Cain and Abel's parents. They've been expelled, but that relationship with God, the entering back into that presence, can be restored through sacrifice, through a giving up of something. So Adam and Eve took from God what they desired. So God says, of course, you may freely eat of every tree in the garden. This one in particular, don't eat of it. And he gives a warning that they will die. But they see and take for themselves what they want, it says. So they took what they desired outside of God's command. Now here, the sons of Adam and Eve seek to offer back to God that which is rightfully his. So what is an offering? An offering is a gesture of faith, a gesture of good faith, in a faith in the relationship, that it can be restored by a giving up of something, by a sacrifice of something, that if I give, then that will mean something, right? That will mean something for my spirit. And God will recognize my gift to him, right? Is what's being established here as the assumption that is being made. Okay. Now, just a little sidebar on sacrifice and why sacrifice? How can we bring this down to our level, since we're not slaughtering animals day in and day out these days? So what is sacrifice? So we all make sacrifices in our lives. Of course, let's just talk about sacrifice on the most basic level. Sacrifice is the dying of something, is the willful dying of something, is the giving up of something, your choice to relinquish something in order or in favor for something better, something greater, something more important. right? So for example, we all know what it is like to trade immediate satisfaction for greater future reward. So an example of that would be I can either choose to gorge on 3 donuts in the morning, but I will have an awful day. And so I sacrifice my desire to eat the donuts so that I reap a reward of the future. I have a more productive day. I have a day where my attitude is better. I don't have a sugar rush and then a crash. These are those examples. I have an immediate gratification that I'm looking for that I am relinquishing, right? So that experience of sacrificing what we want now, which, donuts are great things. So it may still be a good thing, but we're sacrificing it in respect and favor for a higher good, is hopefully one that you know well. And this means that proper sacrifice is the basis of your well-being, right? The fact that you choose to do certain things over other things, but the thing that you're choosing to do is a giving up of something, right? The thing that you're choosing to do is relinquish or let go so that you can receive greater down the line. That is at the heart of what it means to sacrifice. And so I just have a sort of rough hierarchy of sacrifice. We know an example of how this scales ultimately in all of our human experiences in life, right? So our individuality hopefully is most often sacrificed for the sake of our community. And what do I mean by that? If you just choose to be a rigid individual, or you have rigid individualism, you can't really have genuine relationships. Relationships are built on you sacrificing something about your individuality for the sake of someone else. The most basic version of this is that you sacrifice your time and effort to meet a friend up for coffee so that you can establish a relationship with them, right? And you can say, well, no, I'm only doing that for me because it's good for me to have a relationship. That will ultimately make it so that the relationship is not a viable relationship, because as soon as your friend finds that out, and they will find out sooner or later that you're only in it for yourself, you're only in the relationship for what you're going to get out of it, then that relationship, of course, will fall apart. So you have to sacrifice something. You have to be other-centered, other-focused in order to develop relationship in community, for example. And to have community, of course, we are social creatures. We need community in order to thrive. So in order to thrive, we have to let go of something that maybe we want to hold on to. Of course, the community is sacrificed for the sake of family. Hopefully, I am not making it so that my community is so great to me that I'm sacrificing those I'm most responsible for, those in my immediate family or in my extended family, or you could even say within my community family, these people that I'm most responsible for. I shouldn't just sacrifice that for the sake of greater community, right? But at the same time, I should be sacrificing family members and relationship with family members to my values. My values should define how these relationships work out. I'm not going to lie, cheat, and steal for the sake of family. I have a line. I have a value set that I'm not willing to step over that line just because someone is a blood relative, unless, of course, I'm a mobster. But the idea here is that your values come before family, right? Hopefully, it should be the case that your values, and you could say family is my value, but the point here is that truth and morality and ethics and these elements, they come before, just the fact that you have people around you that you're close to and responsible for. If they are asking you to do something immoral, then you hopefully will not. You'll favor the values and the morality over just the fact that someone's asking you to do that. And of course, your values, they are sacrificed to the Most High God. You could say the value of values, right, is the Most High. And of course, that's not necessarily what God is. That is a diminishing. But the point here is that you sacrifice your values in the sense that God is the ultimate good is the one who determines who I am and what are my value sets and what do I value most and how am I, even certain values you are sacrificing for other values. So it's a hierarchy of these things. And that, of course, this is all psychological. This is all interpersonal. But I'm helping you to understand, or I'm hopefully helping you to understand how you can even mentally understand this process of offerings that are made in favor of greater goods, that establish a relationship with that hierarchy, that establish a relationship with the Most High God. Ultimately, is the ascent. You could say the ascent that you're making up that mental, metaphysical hierarchy is the one that goes to God. Hopefully, I'm not getting too deep into the weeds there. But the point here is that sacrifices, you should know what it means to make a sacrifice. And what the sacrifice in the temple is representing is it is representing a very real flesh and blood, literal representation of that process of understanding what it means to make sacrifices. And why is that the case? Because when you bring an offering to the Most High God, you are ritualistically playing out that process that I just went over, that you are reinforcing for your character, for your spirit, and for the society around you and the side of all around you, that you are making the choices that reflect honor of the Most High God most of all, right? That is the highest good, or the highest value, is the worship of God himself. And everything else flows from that. Okay, I think I've talked too much about this. The point here is that as we're talking about what sacrifices mean, as we're talking about what altars and offerings mean, they're about relationship. They're about the things that the death somehow is allowing. The death of something is allowing the priest to enter into the holy place. And how this is, of course, worship of God. It's a recognition, if you're sacrificing to God, it's a recognition of God as the highest good, as the highest thing, as the thing to which the offerings and the gifts would go to, right? And so at this point, I asked the class, which means more as an offering? And there was some speculation, the fruit of the harvest, of course, is a good thing. But then there's the firstborn, the firstlings of the flock of Abel, and the fat portions. So it's not really what the text says about Abel's offering. It's not exactly what the text says about Cain's offering that is significant. It's what the text says about Abel's offering that is significant. In contrast, in comparison to what it says about Cain's offering. So the offering of Abel is the firstborn of the flock, right? So Abel brings some fruit from his harvest, but Abel brings the firstborn of the flock and the fat portions. Why the fat portions? A great verse in the Bible, it comes from Leviticus, and the verse essentially just says, all the fat is the Lord's. So it's a kind of a funny little verse there, but the point here is what is fat? Fat is flavor. If anyone knows cooking at all, you know that fat is where you have flavor. It carries flavor. It carries, you can infuse fat with different flavors. And so Abel is bringing the very best, the first, right? He's bringing that which is honored among all of his flock, highest above all of his flock, the firstborn. There's the pattern of the firstborn as reflected in the ancient world, that the firstborn is the most honored, right? There's a celebration of this first fruits of this firstborn, that the firstborn gets the inheritance totally, right? That the firstborn is the one that we celebrate and is sort of the leader, the one that goes first. And so the firstborn of the flock represents the greatest of the flock. So he's offering the greatest of the flock, and he's offering the fat portion. So it's a very succulent offering, right? It's an amazing offering that Abel is making here. He's making genuinely a superior offering than just some fruit of the harvest. So while it is true that Cain gave something to God, Abel rather gave his very best of what he had to offer. And in doing so, Abel's offering was made as a faith act. Now, what does that mean? I'm going to get into that in a second, but it was made as a faith act. He did not reserve for himself the best of what was his, but he gave it up in trust that God's provision back to him was better than anything he had to let go of. So what does that mean? Abel is giving the best of what he has. Well, that means that he thinks that he doesn't need to hold on to this thing for his well-being to exist, even though it's the best thing that he has, right? And so if Abel gives up the thing that is the best thing that he has, that means that he's acknowledging in faith one who is greater than the best thing that he has. Well, this is what I mean by it being a faith act, that he did not see and take something that he thought might be better, better than God, of course. At this point, I think yesterday is when I said what idolatry is, as presented in the Bible, is when humanity, when the people of Israel, when they worship what should be sacrificed, right? So the perfect example of this is the golden calf. In the story of the Exodus, they create a golden calf and say, this is the God who released you from your slavery in Egypt. And of course, a calf is the thing, or a bull is the thing that should be being sacrificed to the Most High God. You're not going to worship the thing that you're supposed to be letting go of, right? What do bulls represent? What do the firstlings of the flock represent? They represent you being sustained by their milk, you being sustained by their meat. And so if you're letting go of that thing, if you're presenting it as a gift, as an offering to God himself, you are recognizing that God is greater than the offering, right? You don't sacrifice to lesser things, and you don't worship the things that should be sacrificed, these lesser things that are to be sacrificed. You sacrifice lesser things to higher things. And so if Abel is sacrificing the best of what he has to offer, he's sacrificing the very best of what he has to something that he is recognizing as greater and has faith in that this is greater. That God is greater than this thing. Let's talk about what faith is. Let's just kind of go over this because this is important. The Greek word in the New Testament for faith is pistis. Pistis. And faith means something like assurance or trust in the New Testament, right? Faith, according to the Bible, is not a system of beliefs that one sides with over other beliefs. So in the modern world, we talk about our faith as sort of the system that dictates certain things about my life, right? Oh, in my faith, or according to my faith, this, 1, 2, 2, and 3. In the Bible, faith is what you are trusting in, to have faith is that you are putting your trust in something, okay? A good example of this is anyone, if you're watching this video sitting down, you are putting your faith in your chair. You are sitting in a chair. That means you trust it. That means you're putting your faith that it is a working chair, that it will hold up the weight of your body, that it won't burn you, that it won't turn into a wild animal and eat you, right? All of these things that in any possible world could happen, you could say are not going to happen because you have trust in the chair for what it is, right? For its ontology, for the thing that makes it what it is. You believe in it. You believe in that thing and that it will function according to its design, according to what it is, right? And so that's a good example of what it means to have faith in God himself, in Yahweh God, most of all, of course, the creator God, not just higher powers, but the God who is eternal being itself. When you have faith in something, another good example would be like a trust fall, right? Because a trust fall, it's even more intimate than the chair example that I gave. A trust fall is when you have to have faith in a person. So there's a personal relationship aspect going on there. And that's a bit more like a relationship that you have with God. Let's talk about the Hebrew word for faith, emunah. So the Hebrew word for faithfulness, this is actually the word for faithfulness. So the idea of being full of faith, having a quality of faith, is a word implying a sense of assurance or fidelity, right? So in this way, God is said to be one of faithfulness, meaning God in his nature is steadfast and unwavering, particularly you could say about his own nature, right? He is an unchanging God. He doesn't go back against what or who he is. For one to be full of faith toward God, one must be assured of who God is and what he has promised to his people. Again, assured of the ontology of God, the nature of God. Who is God? And do I have faith in that, right? Do I trust? Do I have assurance? Do I have fidelity toward that reality, right? And another Hebrew word for faith, translating to like Abraham trusted or believed God, you could say, is aman. So faith also commonly appears as a verb in the Bible, related to the Hebrew word universally used to conclude prayers, amen, which translates to so be it. The Hebrew word for believed has the same related meaning as emunah, to have faith in something. One actively puts their trust in the something, right? And so it's here that I want us to turn our attention to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4. By faith, Abel brought to God a better offering than Cain. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. So Abel is considered righteous because of his faith. And this is time and time again the pattern of the Bible, that faith is what brings righteousness. Why is that the case? Because Adam and Eve, they lack faith. That is what ultimately causes them to disobey, to break relationship with God through their disobedience by taking of the tree of knowledge apart from his word. Faith in the bringing forth of a better offering, it's exactly what I said. Abel is offering up something that is, in that act, he's acknowledging God is greater than the thing that he is offering, that his worth, that his well-being, that his sustainability, it is not wrapped up in the thing that he is offering. It is wrapped up in the thing he is offering it to. And so it's a trusting that God, I know that I don't need this. I don't need this offering. I don't need this to survive. I don't need the firstlings of my flock. God, you don't need that, but I am recognizing that you are greater and I am giving it to you, right? What Abel has in mind is something better than what he is offering. And that is the thing that he is putting his trust in. The thing he's putting his trust in is God himself. And so that's why you can say it is by faith that Abel brought God a better offering. And that is what faith is, okay? And something else that's really important is all of this is connected, of course, to the greater theme of the Bible, which is that God is the one who makes the sacrifice. This is where it sort of gets all turned on its head, everything that I've been saying, because it's not necessarily even about us making the best sacrifice and then we enter in. We can't make a sacrifice good enough to enter in to the garden. That's the sort of whole point of the scripture, is that God himself provides the lamb. God provides the sacrifice. It is not something that we muster up, this sacrifice, and we make a perfect sacrifice. It's not the quality of our sacrifice that lets us back into the garden. It is the quality of God's sacrifice of the lamb that lets us back in. And of course, the lamb is God, right? So in John chapter 1, verse 29, the next day, John saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." So the ultimate end of this whole theme that I've been talking about of sacrifice and altars and entrance back into the holy place is this idea that God himself is the one who provides the means by which the priest enters back in. In fact, he is that priest who enters back in, right? Jesus becomes everything involved in this story. He becomes the slain prophet who is Abel. He's the lamb who is sacrificed on the altar, and he is the priest who enters back into the holy place. this is getting ahead of ourselves, but I just want to frame for you that don't take away everything that I've said about sacrifice and about us making sacrifices as the end of the story, right? The point here is that in our lifetime, we never genuinely, without the Holy Spirit, will ever make a sacrifice that is you could say worthy, right? And even with the Holy Spirit, no sacrifice we ever will make is worthy, but we are united to Christ in his sacrifice, and we are crucified with Christ. So he says, take up your cross and follow me. That means that his sacrifice becomes the sacrifice that is our sacrifice. Now, a perfect sacrifice has been made on our behalf. So all of that to say, what is being portrayed here in the text is an establishment of the idea of sacrifice, an establishment of the idea of the one who will be able to enter back in, hopefully, one day, be able to enter back into the garden. I've talked at length about this, so now let's continue because we need to get into the murder. Okay, so in all of this, what is significant in the story of the Cain and Abel is, of course, not the sacrifice, but the fact that this sacrifice is almost made in vain. And now it's appearing to me, the name of Abel, it means something like vapor or vanity. And so the sacrifice of Abel is made, and the response, of course, is that Abel is going to die because of it. Die not because God wants that to happen, but because Cain is sinful. So Cain's face fell in response to the rejection of his offering to God. This is the first time conceptually the idea of being fallen is used in the Bible. Here, the attitude of Cain's heart toward God and toward his brother is a fallen attitude. His direct response to God's instruction is bitterness and resentment. Nafal, that's the term. And here we have to understand the attitude of Cain's heart already was not toward proper sacrifice to God, that he would give up the first fruits or the best of what he had to offer. I just want to stop here just for a second, and I'm recalling as I was talking about sacrifice, there is something in the New Testament about worship and sacrifice that is important. In Romans chapter 12, Paul says, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. And be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? So the idea is we do still make sacrifices. We are enabled to make proper sacrifices. The sacrifice that Paul asks us to make is the only way we are capable of making those sacrifices is because we live by the Spirit, which has to do with the earlier chapters of Romans. And so I just wanted to bring that up again, that there is a fulfillment of this process of making a proper sacrifice. It's not, Jesus, of course, makes the perfect sacrifice once and for all, but the true and proper worship is that we continue to relinquish our lives and lay down our lives so that God can come and dwell and live in us in those places that we're letting go of, right? That we're giving them over to God. So just wanted to say that for a second. Okay, back to Cain. So he is downcast. He is fallen. His face has fallen. And what does God say? God says, let's just go back into the passage. He says, why are you angry, and why has your countenance or your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, and here the word here is if you do tov, so good, and we've gone over tov and ra in the Bible already, what those Hebrew words mean. So if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Okay, so the Hebrew word for sin is chata. And the Hebrew word for sin is used for the first time in this passage. So nowhere else in the Bible earlier has this term been used. Here, sin is personified as a creature crouching down in attack position, ready to strike out at Cain. Literally speaking, to chata is to miss the mark. That is to fail at achieving a specific purpose. Going back into the Tov and Ra aspects again, I talked a little bit about how Tov is intrinsically intrinsically aligned with God's creation order. Tov being the Hebrew word for good. It is something that operates within the design of reality, you could say. It operates within how reality is supposed to work and how it does work in its nature, because it is how God created it to be. And so Tov is things are functioning according to what they are. And the example that I use is a cup. The purpose of a cup or a bottle is to hold liquid so that I can drink it, right? There's a functional, again, ontology. The ontology is a fancy word for what makes something what it is. And there's a functional ontology of the thing about these elements, right, that come together and make it functional for a purpose of serving me, right, of serving my purposes, which is that I want water, right? Or you could say serves the purpose of my neighbor when I share my water with them. The purpose of the cup is to hold water, and it's ultimately the purpose is seated in a higher purpose of, you could say, hydration, of my flourishing, of my life. So all things in reality have these purposes that scale. And Ra is when these purposes, they fall apart. When the bottle becomes broken, when it has a hole in it, then it can no longer hold water. This is when it goes into the trash, right? Because the whole point of the cup is to hold water, and it's no longer holding water. And so now, what do you do with it? Right? What is the point? You can, of course, repair it, or it is broken, and it's just, you could say perpetually broken until something is done about it. And so that's what Ra is. Ra means if there's a raw thing, it means it's causing a waywardness, it's causing a bentness, it's causing a problem in the world, right? Something it's not operating according to its functional design, its purpose, right? Its purpose, its teleology, that word for what is something designed for. Ontology is what makes something what it is. Teleology is what is its ultimate purpose and design. And so, to what end is it being made? And so, what sin is a failure. It is a hole in the cup, right? It's a missing of the mark. So humanity was originally created by God with intention and design to reflect his good nature by operating in creation as his imagers. What sin does is keep us from achieving God's original intention. Sin is our rejection of God and our bent will to do what we want apart from God's nature. It is our failure to aim for and shoot rightly toward what we were made for. In the Bible, it is this idea that is conveyed as the heart of what makes the world so wrong, right? Of course, in a biblical vision, a biblical worldview, the sin is the problem, right? This aspect of our being that causes us to want to do things and do things that are apart from what we are supposed to do, right? That the things that we are supposed to do, we do not do them, and the things that we do are things that we're not supposed to do, right? And so that is what sin is. And so what God is saying to Cain is that this quality or this power of sin wants Cain. It has a desire for Cain, right? And so this is very interesting that this quality of missing the mark, this ability to miss the mark, this aspect of missing the mark. Think about aiming for something and misfiring, right? Is personified in this passage. And so it makes you think back, of course, to the serpent in the garden, this tempter, this deceiver. Except here in this passage, whereas the serpent was presented as shrewd and cunning and deceitful in the previous passage, here, this sin that is crouching at the door is personified in a much more sinister way as a wild animal lying down in the grass, waiting to pounce, right? Waiting to strike out at Cain and take Cain captive. And so even in the Old Testament, in passages like this, you have this concept of sin is a element of the world that is outside of humanity, right? That enters into humanity, but originates outside, right? That originates, or this quality of wanting to enslave humanity, wanting to master humanity. That is a spiritual reality that precedes humanity. And so in the Bible, all evil is first spiritual evil, is what is being conveyed, is that the reason people do evil things is because they're spiritually compelled to do so. Now, they're still actively participating in the rebellion. They're still actively participating in the sin act, and they're responsible for their participation in the sin act. But what is instigating the sin act is the spiritual reinforcement of that, right? Is the tempting by evil spirits. Lot more that goes into that later on down the line, but I just want you to observe this idea of kind of a repetition of Eve and the serpent, but in a different light. Now it's this hostility, it's this anger, it's this serpent or this creature that is lying there at the door. Some commentators will assume that the door there that is being spoken of is, of course, the door to the garden. That for Cain, there's something that's blocking the way, right, to the gate, to the garden, and that is the sin, right? That Cain must master. Of course, he doesn't master it. So let's get into it. Cain cannot help himself. His pride and his envy easily gets the better of him. He is the older brother, after all. Why should his younger sibling Abel get the better of him? Cain deserves what he is rightfully owed. Cain deserves the blessing of his brother, and he worked hard. He worked the ground hard for his harvest. Shouldn't he be recognized the same as Abel? From Cain's point of view, God has been infuriatingly unfair, right? So we talked as a group in the original class meeting about how the insecurity of Cain is ultimately what gets the better of him. And we talked about how that insecurity is the same kind of insecurity that manifests in the garden itself in the original fall of Adam and Eve, that Cain is not, if he had continued in this conversation with God, we also noted that, God is the one who comes to Cain and speaks to him, and Cain doesn't respond, right? So there's a fatherly encouragement coming from God himself, and Cain is sort of refusing that because he's retreating into himself. He's retreating into his insecurity, and he's dealing with his insecurity in the only way that he knows how to. The idea here is he brought a sacrifice less than what was due God. And God recognized that. And God didn't really accept it. He didn't allow that to be the case. He said, I'm not going to let you bring me something less than what I'm worth, right? Of course, he's God. He has the right to do that. And he should do that. He ought to do that. Being God, he is the ultimate good. And so you're not going to bring lesser things to the ultimate good in a sense that it's less than what he deserves and what you have to offer. And so Cain works hard, of course. You could say he's a tiller of the ground. He's a hard worker. But he doesn't bring God what he is rightfully owed. Abel does. And so Abel's offering is favored. And of course, we've talked about how Abel's offering is an offering of faith. And what we can see here is that Cain's offering is not an offering of faith. It's not an offering of trust in God, that of what God just said, if I do well, yes, I will be, my offering will be accepted, right? It's not a trust in what God is saying to him. It is an insistence and a lack of faith that he deserves something, and he can go his own way, and he doesn't need this whole system, right? That he doesn't need God, you could say. He doesn't need to have this relationship with God, because ultimately what he decides is to murder his brother, right? We know that it's not a murder of a passion. It's not a murder of passion even. The way that it's presented in the text is a calculated murder. Let us go out into the field, Abel. And the idea here is that he plotted to kill his brother even. He wanted to do away with the thing that held him in contempt, right? Abel, just by setting a standard, just by being different in the sense that Abel's offering is better, and Cain now has to stand in comparison to his younger brother. Cain does away with Abel. His ultimate goal is not that he reform himself, but that he just get rid of the problem in his mind, right? Which is the undoing of God's creation through violence. You have the blood of Abel seeping into the ground, which is going to be important. And of course, God encounters in the same way that God encounters Adam and Eve in the garden. God comes to Cain and he asks a question about what he already knows. Where is your brother? And of course, that's not for God's knowledge. That's for Cain to fess up, right? Notice the immense patience. And we'll get into this when we talk. Well, we can talk about it now. God puts a mark on Cain and says, whoever kills Cain will be avenged 70 or sevenfold, right? Will be avenged sevenfold. And the idea here is that God is putting a stopper on the killing, right? He doesn't want more blood to be shed. He doesn't want Cain to be there to be vengeance against Cain. He is acting in patience and mercy and allowing Cain, hopefully, to come around in repentance. That's not what happens in the story, but the point here is that God is immensely merciful. He asks a question. He doesn't just show up and kill Cain on the spot, right? Go to Adam and Eve and say, all right, bear another one. He gives Cain an opportunity to repent. However, Cain's response is even more hostile than Adam's in the garden. He says, who do you think I am? Am I my brother's caretaker? You know, this is not exactly the words that appear, but this is essentially what is being said. You know, how am I supposed to know where my brother is? I'm not his daddy. Right, is what he's saying, right? And here Cain is playing angry and dumb in the presence of Almighty God. So someone commented in our meeting that this is the first time someone talks back, right? Someone talks back to God. It's immensely dumb. The idea here that Cain is being, he's being foolish, he's playing dumb. And this is the sort of situation where Adam ultimately did, he pointed fingers, but he didn't talk back in this way, right? His heart is, again, continuously bent away from the reality of what he has done and the reality of the situation. So Adam, remember the Hebrew word for Adam, or the Hebrew word for humanity is Adam. And Adam, of course, is taken out of the Adamah, out of the ground. So he's an earthling, he is a groundling, he is a dirtling, right? He comes out of the soil or the ground, the Adamah. And now Abel's dam, I keep getting them mixed up, which is the Hebrew word for blood, is now back in the ground, the Adamah, right? So you can see the relations between these words here, that there's a sort of rhyming or there's a poeticness to the Hebrew language here. The dam of the Adam, Abel, so the man Abel, is crying out to God from the Adamah. This liquid life that was given from God to form the man is now spilt upon the earth from which it came. Cain, in murdering Abel, has unmade what God has made. And this, of course, ignites chaos and destruction in the world as Cain builds a city out of this. So also think about the relations to Cain is a tiller of the ground, and now the ground is soaked or cursed further with the blood of his brother. So even more, it is the case that the effects of the fall are going to be felt in the world as Cain is driven further east of the garden and into the land of Nod. And I just love the language that is being used here. The ground has opened its mouth wide. Again, it harkens forward, you could say, to the prophet Isaiah saying that Sheol has opened its mouth wide to receive you. It's talking about apostate Israel. And the ground has opened its mouth wide, almost like a serpent, you could say, swallowing its victims. The ground has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood, which flows from your hand. You can just imagine the blood of Abel flowing out from the hand of Cain into the ground. It's a very beautiful, for lack of a better term, beautiful image, very artistic image. And of course, by beautiful, I don't mean like in a good sense. I just mean that it's very significant. Okay, so what we have had manifest in this story is the pattern that was established back in chapter 3 about this curse that was placed upon the serpent, where God says to the serpent, I will put hostility between you and the woman, between your seed, so the seed of the serpent, and her seed, the seed of the woman. He will crush your head and you will crush his heel. Of course, this passage is not reflective necessarily of the he will crush your head and you will crush his heel part of the story. That doesn't come until the crucifixion of Jesus. But the hostility between the seed of the woman and the serpent is what's in view here. The idea that there are rival offsprings, there are rival lineages, right, between the antagonist in the garden, the serpent, and the woman who was deceived. That the woman is going to give birth to children who will ultimately be in an antagonistic relationship with the serpent and with his seed, and who is the offspring of the serpent, and that ultimately what comes out of that is the ultimate showdown between these figures, between the seed of the woman and the seed and the serpent himself. But remember that we talked about this. By following the serpent, humans align themselves with the serpent and become the seed of the serpent. So the seed of the woman becomes the seed of the serpent when they follow after the serpent's ways. And perfect examples of this, we already covered this, but remember, Jesus himself is calling people sons of the devil, right? So the idea, or the offspring of vipers and snakes, right? And in 1 John chapter 3, we should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one, right? So the idea is Cain himself is the son of the serpent. He is the seed of the serpent because the sin that was crouching at the door ultimately came on him. And he, and as it said of Judas, Satan entered him, right? This idea that he became a seed of the serpent, right? And so the offspring of the serpent versus the offspring of the woman, that is what has manifest in this story, in the first pattern, or the first, iteration of that pattern. But this is centrally the pattern that appears throughout the text of the scripture and throughout history broadly. And this is what I have been trying to get at, especially back at the beginning when I talked about the mythic nature of this story. I'm not making this up. This is what Jesus says himself in the New Testament. Now, throughout the text, if you weren't already aware, throughout the text of the Bible, throughout the narrative and the story of the Bible, what is the central conflict? One of the central conflicts, or one main pillar central conflict, you could say, is the conflict between those who are in power, those who have authority, and the prophets who speak truth to that power and then are ultimately killed for it. Right? The idea here is that you have figures in the text who ascend a hierarchy of importance, and the world is worse for it, right? That they are corrupt individuals, corrupt leaders in the world. And you have the prophet, who is the wilderness wanderer, who comes in and essentially calls these people out and speaks truth and calls them to repentance. And then they are ultimately killed for it, right? That they're ultimately put to death. So Isaiah is sawn in half, right? John the Baptist, his head is cut off, right? All of these prophets, they undergo. Samuel is driven out into exile. He becomes a fugitive. And so time and time again, you have the process in which a prophet, what is a prophet? A prophet represents the one who is bringing the words of God to the leaders, to the people, and calling them to repentance, and ultimately suffering for it, becoming a martyr. And so when you have the story of the text, especially as you get into the kingdom of Israel, that the antagonism between seed of woman and serpent is at play there, between the corrupt kings of Israel, the corrupt kings of Judah, and the prophets, like the prophet Elijah, who call them out and then ultimately are driven out of town. Elijah becomes an exile, is what I was trying to say, from Jezebel. So the point here is, what is being displayed in the story of Cain and Abel is the story and the pattern of the entire Bible. So let's get into it. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 23, he is summarizing the story of the Bible in this passage. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness." Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous, and you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead, then, complete what your ancestors started. And by that he means, of course, go ahead and take me. He says this because he is the antitype, meaning he is the last iteration of this pattern, or at least you could say the ultimate iteration of this pattern in his being slain as a prophet, right? He is the slain prophet that covers all the sin of the world. And again, there's an inversion and a remixing of the Cain and Abel story there, because he is not only the offering that is being made, but he is the slain prophet who was making the offering, Abel, right? And he is the door to the garden. He gathers up all of these images and these symbols in himself. And then he goes on, he says, you snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore, I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly, I tell you, all this will come on this generation. And of course, he means that to be the case because he is the perfect slain lamb. He is the perfect prophet who dies. And it is the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, and the Roman Empire that ultimately colludes in putting him to death. And so that's sort of what he's getting at there. And when he says, I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers, some of them you will kill and crucify, ... This is the idea of martyrdom, right? This is the idea that this pattern actually does continue. Now it continues with joy and rejoicing that all the martyrs of the history of the church, they go joyfully to their death because they recognize now in freedom that this is the pattern that ultimately brings about the new creation. That it is the testimony or the witness of the martyrs in their sacrifice that they make of themselves in the martyrdom, that they are following after the pattern of Jesus, that they are taking up their cross and following him. And every time we die to ourselves, there's also an internal, this seed of serpent, seed of woman battle, this seed war also is an internal battle between you could say the spirit and the flesh, right? The idea that you have to die to your desires, have to die, your flesh has to die, right? Put to death to the desires of the flesh and become a martyr for the sake of Christ. And so the idea here that is being presented in the text of the Bible is the story of Abel. And again, I'm not saying it, Jesus is the one that said it. The story of Abel is a pattern that goes all the way to the end of the Old Testament. The idea of every prophet that was slain upon the earth is this pattern, that the blood of Abel is on the hands, the blood of Abel is on the Pharisees of the day, right? So he's drawing a distinction that the Pharisees, calling them the offspring of the serpent, he actually is objectively calling them that, the offspring of the serpent, and he's saying on you is the blood of Abel. And so it's this connection back, and he's saying, and why is that the case? The Pharisees, just like Cain, are bringing sacrifices. They're bringing things to God that are unworthy of God, right? They're making all of these rules, but they are neglecting the weightier matters, right, is what Jesus will say. They're making all of these religious rules and these religious rites, and they're doing all of these things that reflect that they are holding back something. They're doing all these things in order to get favor with God, something that they deserve, right, that they want, that they're working really hard. You could say they're building a city in order to be right with God, when really what God wants is their heart. What God wants is their life. And so they're bringing a lesser sacrifice by making all these rules and imposing upon everyone else these rules. And that's something else that he is going to be hard on them for. Again, Pharisees being the seed of the serpent, that they don't have to be that, and none of us has to be that. Oftentimes in the Bible, you have seed of serpent switching to seed of woman. or the reverse. It depends on what role are you playing in the story ultimately. And so, of course, many Pharisees, they turn into disciples, and they become the seed of the woman by turning into a disciple, by receiving the blood and body of Christ. So Paul being just one example, but there's also Nicodemus and these other individuals that show up in the text that are Pharisees. So all of that to say, I just want it to be clear that you can draw a definitive line between the story of Cain and Abel to the Gospels, that this is one unified story, that it's coherent between these passages, that this is the through line of the Bible. What we're doing is we're setting up the pattern of the Bible. This is what these early chapters have done in Genesis and will continue to do, is this pattern that is being set up ultimately will find its fulfillment in the story of the New Testament. So we'll get there when we get there. Okay, just to finish up, let's talk about the land of wandering. This is the land of Nod. Nod means wandering, right? So though exiled from the garden, the family of Adam and Eve still remained in the region of Eden. The murder of Abel, though, further drives humanity from God's ideal realm for human flourishing. Cain is driven out to wander the land outside of Eden, where he eventually builds a city. Remember, east, he goes east of Eden, and remember, east means past. So there's almost this concept that he's going into a regression. He's going, if Adam, and of course the temple is facing the sun, it's facing east, and as the priest moves westward, he moves into the temple. And so what's happening to Cain is he's being driven east from the temple, so he's going even further back. He's regressing, and you could say he's going back into that dry land, the land of wandering that Adam came from. Now, something to be said here that's not in the slides is he's sent by God into the land of wandering. It's almost as though he's taking Abel's place, right? He's sent by God and meant to wander the land. This might be reading into it, but the idea here is again, God is not just killing him outright on the spot. God is giving him an opportunity to reform. He's giving him an opportunity to repent. Cain doesn't do that, though. What does he do? He builds a city. And so implicit within the text here is an opportunity for Cain to and you know what? Now that I think about it, there is a connection here between Moses killing a man and being sent into the wilderness for 40 years, to be a shepherd for 40 years. And so there is a sense in which it's kind of similar to that Cain has an opportunity to all the rough edges of his personality can be chiseled, as one once said, in the wilderness, and he can be directed by God in the wilderness, reformed and changed back into the man he is supposed to be. But ironically, what happens here is the construction of a city. So he doesn't wander, he builds a city, and it's out of his insecurity and fear. He doesn't trust that the mark that God placed on him is an authentic mark, right? This idea of I will be protected by God. No, I won't be protected by God. I have to build for myself a city. And why am I saying that? Because Cain's building of a city is not an idealistic turn in the story. It is a reinforcement of the problem. In the ancient world, cities served as the protective fortresses against enemies, against other armies, right? And so Cain was sent into the land of wandering by God, but instead he settles down and sets up shop. Cain's city, thematically, is founded upon the blood of Abel. Very significant that the city is founded upon the blood. That the sacrifice, a human sacrifice, is what is made in order to bring about this city. And this is again, speaking mythically here, this is a pattern that shows up in lots of ancient myths, is the idea of the death that is required in order to bring about human civilization, right? And so historian and sociologist French René Girard, he goes into this idea of the founding murder, which shows up in these different stories. So the theme of the founding murder is not only mythical, but also biblical. We find it in the book of Genesis, in Cain's murder of his brother Abel. If you're listening to this and not watching, I'm reading a quote now from René Girard. The account of this murder is not a founding myth. It is rather the biblical interpretation of all founding myths. It recounts the bloody foundation of the beginnings of culture and the consequences of this foundation. How does Cain go about founding the first culture? The text itself does not pose this question, but it gives an answer by virtue of focusing on two themes. The first is the murder of Abel. The second is Cain as the founder of the first culture. This culture is clearly presented as the direct extension of the murder. We find still other references to the founding murder in the Gospels. The idea is presupposed by two parallel passages in Matthew and Luke that mention a chain of murders similar to the Passion and going back to the foundation of the world. Matthew refers to the murder of the prophets. Luke's text has the murder of all of the prophets since the foundation of the world, that is, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah. The last link in this chain is the crucifixion of Jesus, which resembles all the previous murders. So the idea here is that it is the death of Abel itself that enables the birth of civilization, right? And two points here. Number one, this is something that we see in reality. This pattern, this idea that death and destruction is required in order for human civilization and technology to advance. Most of our technology in the 21st century would not be the way that it is and be here as it is had not World War I and World War II happened, right? So that's just one example in the most recent past of how the death and destruction, the piles of bodies, somehow give way. You could say in a causal or correlated way, right? This is not a scientific description. We're describing these things symbolically and metaphorically, of course, and thematically in the story of humanity. It gives way to technological advancement and to the goods that we appreciate today, the goods and the bads, right? There's a lot of that comes out of the industrial and technological revolution that is wrong and bad, and a lot that is good. And this is what you see in the story of the text of Scripture, that Cain murders Abel, that he builds a city, and out of that city come good and bad things, right? Out of the city, out of human culture comes those who play the lyre and pipe, right? So instrumentation and music is born. Culture is born. The idea of being able to sing songs, and this is what is born within the city. But also within that city is metalworking, and that can either be a good or bad thing. Metalworking can be used for tools for the harvest. It can also be used to create weapons of war, right? And so the idea here is that the murder brings about technological advancement. That there's an inherent link between the culture of murder and technological advancement. The military-industrial complex, you could say, is the root of that is found here in the murder of Abel. The idea that people make money off of war, right? And civilization, it continues to develop because of war. That the heart or root of civilization and society is violence. And it's very significant. And so with that, whereas human civilization was meant to be built off of the garden, now it's built off of the city, which is a sort of artificial garden. It's the walled city. It's something that is made, that is smithed, that is crafted by Cain, whereas that ordered realm had already been created. But now he goes to the wilderness, he goes to the desert, and he creates for himself a sort of pseudo version of that, right? He creates for himself a version of the garden that is almost the anti-garden, right? Whereas you have Christ and you have the Antichrist, you have the garden and you have the anti-garden, which is the city. This artificial, God planted a garden. The garden is something that is gifted by God. It is the ordered realm. It is the temple realm. But in the city, you have the same sort of habitable realm, but now it is created by man, not by God. This is a quick little sidebar as we're wrapping up. Humans outside the garden, right? So the question is, tradition has said throughout the ages that Adam and Eve are the first humans that live, right? But there is an implied assumption in Genesis 4 that beyond just Adam, Eve, and their only surviving child, there may already be more humans at this time besides just these three. And there's a couple ways that you can reconcile this. Before I get into those ways, I just want to reinforce and acknowledge the text, the author itself has its priorities, has his priorities, and those priorities are not always our priorities. So for the author, the priority is all the things that we've been talking about, establishing these themes of the Bible, establishing these patterns, not a historically detailed account of where did these people come from, and answering all these plot hole questions, right? The plot is not concerned with these elements that we necessarily in the modern world are concerned. We get wrapped up in these details, and an ancient person is just not concerned as much in these details, the ancient writer of the text. But it does cause for us the question, right? So there's a couple ways to reconcile this, to understand sort of how we're to understand this, or there's a couple different ways to understand this. So while some would argue that those seeking revenge, so there's a few different groups of people that are mentioned. One, those that would seek revenge against Cain for Abel, right? Also, Cain's wife, just sort of dropped in there. Cain, knew his wife, and it's like, where did his wife come from, right? As well as 3, the residents of this city. So you're going to build a city of one person, right? Who is going to be in this city? So some would argue that these are actually all blood relatives coming from the incestual relationships, right? The thing about this, though, is you have to then read into the text a non-chronological way of sort of telling the story of the birth of humans, right? Because you have Adam and Eve, then it says you have Cain and Abel. Now Abel is dead, but now you have a woman. So now you have to read into the text that there were other people born long before this event took place, and that those people had been marrying each other, right? Others would suppose that the biblical author is actually referring to the presence of other humans who were created by God besides Adam and Eve. So another solution is to just say that Adam and Eve are not the only couple, right? That maybe in Genesis 1, there's a creation of humanity generally. In Genesis 2, you have the creation of the priesthood, right? And some people will take it that way, that Genesis 1 is a overall creation of, you could say, the creatures called humanity, who are the image of God. But then in the Genesis chapter 2, you have the creation of a priesthood. The wrench that you throw in there is that it says that Eve is the mother of all of the living, right? So it really depends on how you want to take that verse. What does it mean that Eve is the mother of all the living? That will determine whether or not you can reconcile with that assumption. Either way, the point here is that you're making an assumption that you're reading into the text certain elements. Number one, you're either reading into the text that there are just other people around that were born before this thing happened, and the writer just is assuming that you know that, and that's your assumption. That would be sort of how you're looking at it, or you're assuming, yes, God created other humans besides Adam and Eve, clearly, because look at all these people that are here, and all that have been spoken of since Adam and Eve are Cain and Abel, and one is dead now, right? So there's 3 people on the earth at that time? No, there's more, and God created more, right? And so that's just up to you, sort of how you want to go about that. The point here is this is interesting and fun speculation. It doesn't really get into the meaning of the story, and that's why it's not a priority. It should not be a priority for us as we're interpreting the story, and it's not really a priority for the writer, because the writer is not. There are times in the Bible where the author needs to give a sort of annotation that says, okay, so let me explain to you how this works, because it does make sense for the meaning of the story, but not here, right? And so we just sort of leave it at that, if that makes sense. The point is the meaning of the story and its connections throughout the rest of the Bible. Going back to the main point, though, the origins of our innate critique of society. So when most people think of society, they often will think about the good things, some of the good things, but also the bad things. That society is corrupt, that society is broken, that there are problems with society, that there's institutional issues, that there's a sense of systemic brokenness, that there's an evil to the world that is inherent within it. And this is where you get a lot of the revolutionary spirit that shows up throughout, which is ironically just a sort of cannibalism of the same sort of story of what's going on here. But this idea that the whole system is rigged and we need to tear it down, right? Ironically, that is still the way of Cain. Cain has a sense that the system of sacrifice is rigged, and so he needs to essentially take up arms and tear it down, and so he kills his brother. But so we don't want to go the way of Cain by critiquing what Cain ultimately gave birth to, which is a corrupt world, right? That the city that he builds, the first culture, the foundation of culture in the world is built on violence, that it's built on these things where we were created ultimately to be good. Remember, we talked also that there is a glorious past. That glorious past is the realm of the garden. That humans were made to flourish, that humans were made to be fruitful and multiply, to honor God, to be imagers of God, to represent God on the earth, and that every human being on the earth is an image, that they reflect who God is and his goodness and his nature, right? But the idea here is now that as humanity begins to multiply, be fruitful and multiply, as they carry that out, they are simultaneously carrying out and spreading the sin of Cain, right? And spreading the sin of Adam. That this is the foundation layer of humanity. Are these mistakes that are being made, right? And so with that, it's like if there's a weakness in the structure down at the foundation, it will be reflected in the top, right? And so as humanity begins to ascend, as it begins to build for itself means of ascension through technological means, right? As they begin to build a tower, and so looking ahead to Genesis chapter 11, that it is ultimately a 100% corrupt system. I sort of take that back because the idea here is that God will redeem the system, right? That technology in and of itself is not bad. God is going to use technology for his means to accomplish his goals, to return humanity to the state of blessedness. And so we'll get into that, especially as we get into the story of the ark, and as we get into the stories of the temple and the tabernacle, and of course, as we get to the end of the Bible, is God's sort of inversion, that he is using evil things. He's letting these evil things ultimately bring about good things. So we read the Boast of Lamech, that this descendant of Cain is intensifying what was meant to be sort of a hedge of protection around Cain, what was meant to be a stopper and a deterrence for more violence, right? Is that Cain would be avenged if anyone killed him. Now you have someone taking that thing that God said and turning it in on itself and saying, okay, so if Cain is he essentially takes the mark of Cain on himself and says, but intensifies it and says that I'm going to kill everyone around me who insults me because I will be avenged even greater than Cain, right? So it's a twisting and it's a taking of what God intends and a twisting of it and a corruption of it. This is the sort of that death spiral that I have been talking about time and again. And this is where we're going into this continuous fall. So the incident in the garden is not the Bible's only explanation for why the world is so wayward. In fact, Genesis 3-11 collectively tells the multi-step story of a continuous fall, right? And so next time we're going to get into the second major event of the Bible that involves this fall. It's going to be a big deal. It's going to be a little weird and wacky, and I told the group this as we met. So if you're not familiar with the story of Genesis 6 and the Nephilim, it's going to feel a little weird. But remember, we are getting into these really, really deep and ancient and foundation layer ways of thinking about things that are so fundamental to understanding the Bible. Now, ending on one last thing, I just want to remind, and I've already hinted at this, but the idea of cities, even though I had said that there is a bias toward sort of pasture land living amongst the individuals of the Bible that are called by God, those who are called by God are called into the wilderness, but they're ultimately called to look forward to a city. They're called to look forward to the kingdom, is what is sort of described in the Bible. So Hebrews chapter 11, verse 9 and 10, by faith, Abraham migrated to the land of promise as if it were foreign, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the promise. So what is the promise? He migrates to the land of promise as a foreign land, as a nomad, and he dwells in tents. He doesn't settle down. He's a nomadic herdsman, right? Living in the promised land. But what he's waiting for is the city that has foundations, or you could say proper foundations, whose architect and builder is God, right? So the city that is built by Cain is the city of man. It is the city of death and destruction. It is a city that is born out of these things. What God does is he redeems the city. The ultimate goal is the city of God, right? This idea of of this thing that is built by God himself that is a realm in which humanity is able to flourish. That's what the garden ultimately did represent. That's what the garden was pointing toward. And so when you have in the end of the New Testament, in the end of the entire Bible, you have the coming down of the heavenly city, the new Jerusalem, the city of God. You have a city on the earth that is now fully integrated with the will of heaven. As Jesus calls to pray, calls his disciples to pray, let your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So the idea here is that there is a city that is being looked for, that is being sought after, that is being waited for. And that ultimately a city conceptually is not itself a bad thing. The idea of constructions of humans participating in building, in developing, and working on the development and flourishing of humanity through things like technology, right? Technology doesn't have to be inherently bad, and we're going to see that throughout the rest of the scripture. The idea here is that God is the one who is instigating the development of these things. It's not the willful rebellion of his creatures that is instigating these things. It is God himself who chooses. It is in his timing. And that is how we get into the whole aspect of Cain is looking down at the cursed ground, and Abel is looking up towards where he is going next. He's being led by the Spirit. He's walking with God in the pasture land. There's a passage from Isaiah that I just want to get into that I think sums up essentially everything that we've gotten into when it comes to the cosmic mountain imagery, when it comes to the city imagery, when it comes to the stuff having to do with Cain and Abel. So Isaiah chapter 2. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the mountain of Yahweh, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between nations and settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. What's significant about this passage, of course, is the mountain language, which we've talked about, the idea that the nations now, eventually in the last days, not in the beginning, but in the last days, the mountain is now something that all the nations stream to. Right? That they stream up to it. Whereas it's so interesting, whereas in the garden, you had the 4 rivers that descend out from the mountain of Eden and into the world, and to cover all the nations with its water. Now you have all the nations in Isaiah chapter 2 streaming up to the mountain of the Lord. But what's most significant here in relation to our passage is they will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Of course, Cain was a harvester of the ground. He was someone who worked the ground with tools. And he, of course, used his power to kill his brother. The idea of the eternal kingdom is a reversal of that, is the idea that they will ultimately turn their swords back into tools for harvest. There's a reversal of the effects of Cain in the holy city, in the New Jerusalem. And so that's what I want to get into last, is just the word Yerushalayim, right? Jerusalem, the city of peace. Jerusalem means city of shalom, or in English, city of peace. This is immensely important and connected all the way forward to what is referred to later in the Bible as the New Jerusalem, the eternal city of fullness and wholeness, right? Jerusalem is both an archetype as well as the literal correspondent. It's a real city. You can go there today for what is known as the celestial city that comes down from heaven. That comes down from God, that God is giving a command from on high, and now the spread of his kingdom is going out into the world and filling the world with the holy city, with the essence of the holy city. So, with all of that to say, the point here is to not say city bad, rural good, urban and rural and rural divides. You know what I mean? The point here is not, it's so that we observe how these patterns, they work out in the world, how these patterns work out in the Bible in particular, that the Bible is tapping into these ideas that those on the fringes of society, those out in the wilderness, they are connected to their creator in such a way that is allowing them to, because of their reliance on him, their need for him. Whereas cities, through the technology, it numbs you to your need for God. That ultimately will not always be the case, right? The idea here is that cities, technology, development, human flourishing, that is ultimately the design, but within the purposes of the creation, within the purposes of God as creator, that he has for his creation. That ultimately, what God does is he wants us to follow after him and not take and see and take for ourselves what we see is good in our own eyes. Kill our brother and build a city out in the wilderness, right? We're to wait in the garden for it to become the garden city, you could say. So with all of that to say, next week we are going to get more into what makes the world so wrong, according to the Bible. That is, of course, the chapters of Genesis 1 to 11, or excuse me, 3 to 11. And I appreciate you guys, whoever's watching, that you were able to bear with me. I wish that this was able to be a discussion. It did allow me a little bit more time to get into some things in a deeper way, so to really pin down certain things because of the lack of the discussion. But yeah, next time I will make sure that we do not have those same technical issues that kept me from being able to post the meeting. And I hope you appreciate. Comment below what you think of this video and what you have thought of these series of videos and what you think of the story of Cain and Abel. I'd love to hear back from you what you think. And until next time, we will see you next week as we get into Genesis chapters 5 and 6.